Good afternoon, guys, and welcome back to U.S. History 10. I'm Mrs. Marcy Hines, and we're going to finish our discussion today about the Civil War, and we're going to start moving into Reconstruction. Our plan over this week and next week is to finish up the Civil War, move into Reconstruction. We'll talk about what that term means in just a few moments, and then we're going to finish up with industrialization on the last week. So to get us back into where we left off last week, I'm going to go ahead and put the first slide up, as it's telling me I need to restart my computer here for you guys. Sorry about that. We need to pick back up where we left off with the Civil War. And where we're at, guys, we're in the middle of 1863. Remember, as the Civil War started, the Confederacy was making some positive strides. They were moving forward to actually be progressive in their plan to push the Union out of the Confederacy and hopefully, of course, solidly establish the Confederate States of America. But unfortunately, as we get deeper into this war effort, that plan is going to dwindle. Loss of life, loss of supplies, lack of supplies is going to be a major reason why the Confederates are going to lose this war in the end. But where we're at now, we're in the summer of 1863, and we're starting to see, again, more and more problems pop up for the Confederacy. And there's two major battles that we're going to talk about real quick that really solidify the coming of the end of the war. Although the war doesn't end for almost 2 years, these two battles are going to play a significant role in that. So the first battle, real quick, guys, that we're going to talk about is the Battle of Gettysburg. Many of you have probably heard of this battle because of the famous address that Abraham Lincoln gives called the Gettysburg Address, which we're actually going to read here in just a few moments. But this battle happens in July of 1863. And this battle is going to be very significant because this is going to be the last time that the Confederate troops actually make their way into Union territory. From this point forward, the Confederates are going to be pretty much in Confederate territory when it comes to battles from this point forward. Now, the reason that the South is going to invade at Gettysburg in 1863 is actually for supplies. We've got to remember at this point, the South is very low on supplies. They're not industrialized. They don't have access to the supplies, the industrial supplies that the North has. So unfortunately, the South is going to have to go looking for supplies. Now, guys, we could go very, very deep into this battle. It's a major 3-day battle. There's a lot of strategy in this battle that really, in the battle strategy and how it plays out really defines this battle, and it's what's going to lead to the Union actually winning this battle in July of 1863. It's a little complicated, it's a little long to go through, so we're going to not go through that today, but you need to make sure that you know that the significance of this battle is it is the turning point of the war. Like I said earlier, from this point forward, the Confederates will not be able to actually invade the North. They'll never make their way into Northern Territory again, and this is going to lead to an end pretty soon into the end of the Civil War. Now, another major battle that's going to happen that year is going to be the Battle of Vicksburg. And kind of crazy, they actually happen within the same time frame from the beginning of July through about July 4th of 1863. Now, this battle is actually going to deal, and the commander of the Union forces during this battle is going to be Ulysses S. Grant. At this point, he's still the commander of the forces in the Mississippi area, in the Mississippi River Valley, and he is actually going to lay siege on the city of Vicksburg. Why is Vicksburg so important? Because it sits right on the Mississippi River. At this point, that's part of that Anaconda plan that we have talked quite a bit about over the past 2 weeks. That's that plan, of course, to surround the Confederacy and hopefully cripple the Confederacy by surrounding the Confederacy on all sides with Union troops. And if they can take Vicksburg, that could lead to an end, of course, of fighting in the West. There'll still be some fighting in the West, but we're going to start to see the Confederacy break down in the West as a result of this. So Grant is going to lay siege on the town of Vicksburg for days. Actually, the siege actually goes on for weeks. The battle itself is a couple of days, but the siege, this constant siege battle, just bombarding Vicksburg, is going to go on and on and on. And it finally gets to the point where the Confederate soldiers are so beat down, they're going to have to surrender. Supplies are excessively low. They've resorted to eating their horses. They've resorted to eating rats, dogs, whatever they can find to sustain themselves. And it's not just the Confederate soldiers in the town that are having to deal with this. It's also the actual citizens in the town that are basically pillaging for food and trying to find whatever they can to survive. Now, this battle is going to start, like I said, in May. This bombardment is going to start, and it's actually going to end on July 4th of 1863. And the big thing about this battle, guys, is it does cut the Confederacy into, this is it. You've got the Eastern Confederacy and the Western Confederacy separated. Now you have basically the Union slap in the middle between these two fronts of the Confederacy. That's going to lead to a breakdown there. And that's going to lead to, of course, further crippling of the Confederates' cause. Now, by this point, guys, by the time we get to the end of the summer of 1863, we're going to see the Confederate morale very low at this point. People are abandoning the war effort. A lot of people are actually pushing for an end to the war on both sides, the North and the South. And we start to see, too, with Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, his government's starting to break down at this point as well. It's becoming much more ineffective. There's constant conflict within his cabinet over what should be done over this cause, and just the constant beatdown of being beaten battle repeatedly, lack of supplies. This is going to lead to this big breakdown within the governing system of the Confederate States of America. All right, so let's talk about the Gettysburg Address. This is a topic that you guys have probably heard of before. We know who Abraham Lincoln is, one of the most famous presidents in American history. But what is the significance of the Gettysburg Address? One of the interesting things about this address, guys, is how short it is. And we'll see that here in just a moment. We're actually going to read through this address and show you how short it actually is, but really how moving it is as well. So in November of 1863, President Lincoln is actually going to go to the battlefield at Gettysburg, and they're going to have a memorial ceremony. The plan is actually create a national cemetery to honor the individuals that died at Gettysburg. You have to understand, guys, now, for the most part, when people died in battle, they were often during the Civil War, they were often buried where they died. We do start to see a surge. This is where we start to get some new eras in medicine. We start to see the actual embalming of bodies so they can ship soldiers back to their families. But that was mainly rich families that had the ability to do that, to have their family member embalmed and actually send them back to bury them at home. A lot of Union soldiers were able to do that. But for the most part, a lot of poor people weren't able to do that for their soldiers. So most of the time they were buried, of course, where they died. So Gettysburg being one of the biggest battles of the American Civil War, this is why we're going to dedicate this cemetery in November of 1863. And at that address, or at that memorial ceremony, Lincoln's going to give a 2-minute address, and really it asserts the unity of the United States. What he wants to do from the beginning of the war is to pull the United States together, and this address is really going to solidify his want and need to bring the country back to a solidified United States of America, because at this point it's broken in half. And what they also do, what he does in this address, he calls for the living to dedicate themselves to preserving the Union and freedom in the United States. Now, what's so crazy about this whole memorial ceremony is the gentleman that spoke before him spoke for like an hour and a half. And there's probably nobody in history that can really remember what that guy said. But what Lincoln said in 2.5 minutes was so moving that school children still to this day actually memorize this. Actually, before we came on air, a couple of our colleagues in here, they were able to recite the beginning part of this because they learned it in school. And it still plays such a major role in the way that we think about America today. So what we're going to do real quick, guys, we're going to take a look at this address. Again, it's only going to take us about 2.5 minutes long. But remember, looking at this address right here, what kind of document are we looking at here? We're looking at a primary source. Remember, a primary source is a document is written during that time period. And of course, this was written by Abraham Lincoln himself in November of 1863. So, of course, I'm probably not going to do this as eloquently as President Lincoln would have done it, but we're going to read through the Gettysburg Address together real quick. 87 years ago, our fathers brought forward on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated could long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. It's amazing what he did in 2.5 minutes. Just that last line itself really shows that dedication to bringing the country back together. We are a country, of course, that with our government that is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. He's going to be able to accomplish this. Now, sadly, just 2 years later, after Lincoln gives this address, we're going to, of course, see his assassination, which we're going to talk about here in just a few moments. But this speech still resonates in American history. It still is very powerful in its words. And it's just that reminder that we are the United States. We created this nation. We have the ability to pull it back together. And it's kind of telling in these times, these trying times that we're going through now. All right, we could go into Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address so deep, but we got to finish up our discussion about the actual war effort itself. And what we're going to do, guys, is talk about this last little bit of the war, about the last year and a half of the war that's really going to solidify this Union victory and lead to the surrender in April of 1865 by the Confederate Army. Now, let's talk about William Tecumseh Sherman for just a moment in his march to the sea. We haven't talked about Tecumseh Sherman yet, but he's one of the leading generals within the Union Army at this point. Now, by March of 1864, Greene is going to be moved out of the Mississippi River Valley into the Army of the Potomac, into that area. But not only is he going to take over the Army of the Potomac, he's actually going to become the commander of all the Union forces in the Union Army at this point. So now that he's in the East, somebody's got to take over the effort in the West. Now remember, the Confederacy is split in two at this point, so the main effort from this point forward is going to be pushing from the West, from the Mississippi River region, westward, in order to, of course, crush the Confederacy further. Now, like I said, William Tecumseh Sherman takes over the Mississippi Division, and what he and both Greene are going to call for is something called total warfare, okay? You're going to study total warfare when you talk about World War II. You'll talk about it in multiple other wars in American history. But total warfare, what this is, guys, it basically calls for do what you got to do to end this war. Of course, you're not going out killing civilians. That's not what we mean by this. But what we mean by total war is basically destroying anything that can contribute to the Confederate cause. That's destroying barns that house food and cattle, destroying cattle or taking that cattle, destroying ammunition and arms, which that's what we're going to see in Atlanta. When Sherman actually moves into Atlanta in the fall of 1864, that's what one of the famous things about Atlanta is the burning of Atlanta. The old film, Gone with the Wind, which is one of the most famous films about the Civil War, maybe not as history inept as we want it to be, but it kind of gives you an idea of how Atlanta burnt to the ground as a result of Sherman and his troops moving through. But Atlanta's just one of the first stops. What's going to happen here, guys, is that Sherman is going to march the sea starting in the beginning of September of 1864. He's going to start in lower Tennessee, move into northern Georgia, pass through the central part of Georgia, of course, break down Atlanta, it's the capital of Georgia, and then move his way to the sea. And at this point, just destroy everything that you can in the path. Now, this is going to take him a while to do this. He's going to start this in September, and by December of 1864, he's going to make it to Savannah, Georgia. And from there, all he's going to do is turn northward and make his way up towards Virginia to meet up with Grant and hopefully crush the Confederacy by the beginning of 1865. This is going to be devastating here, guys, to the cause. The South is going to be broken down tremendously at this point, and really, there's not a lot of hope for recovery after Sherman's march to the sea. Now, unfortunately, I was having some technical difficulties this morning, guys, and I wanted to have some arrows up here for you to show you where these battles exist. But if you'll look to the right of the map, this is where we really need to focus at this point, because if you look from about the Tennessee area, you can see the blue line where Sherman moves his way through Georgia, makes his way to Savannah, and then turns northward. And again, like I said a moment ago, what's so important about this is that when Sherman moves northward, he's going to meet up with Grant, and this is going to be where the last major battles of the Civil War are going to happen in the area around Richmond, Virginia. And of course, you can see that if you look to the right of the map, you can see Chancellorsville, which is a major battle, Cold Harbor, we see Petersburg. Those battles are going to be some of the solidifying battles that's going to lead to the end of the war, especially in this area. But by the time that we get to April of 1865, Lee knows that the war effort is over. There's not a lot of hope of actually recovering the Confederacy and pushing forward at this point. So before we know it, a surrender is going to take place. So let's talk about the end of the war real quick so that we can start talking about Lincoln, what his plans are for Reconstruction after the war, of course, rebuilding the South, and then, of course, moving to Reconstruction itself. Now, in April of 1864, Lincoln will be elected President of the United States. He was only in his first term. It's kind of crazy. This is what's so interesting about Lincoln's presidency is just from the time that he was elected president to the time that he was assassinated right after he was inaugurated for his second term as president, it's just chaos. With not even within, 3 weeks of him being elected president, South Carolina is going to secede from the Union. And before we know this, the country's fallen apart. So that's one of the reasons why we really revere Abraham Lincoln in American history and really consider him one of the greatest presidents because of the great effort that he put in to try to keep the country together. We've had presidents that have gone through trauma, through a lot of, this is a big discussion now, especially dealing with chaos and crisis that pop up in American history. And basically all of Lincoln's administration was one massive crisis. Think about it in modern history. We've seen that with George W. Bush. He gets into office, 9/11 happens, the Iraq War, Katrina, and we see that as just in y'all's lifetime. You've seen these things actually play out. Of course, America in crisis. We're living through it right now, unfortunately. And that's the thing that we revere so much about Lincoln is the way that he's able to pull us through that crisis. Now, of course, as President of the United States, he's forward thinking. He's thinking about when this war is over with, how are we going to put this country back together? We want to unite the country. If the Union wins, which they are going to win, how are we going to bring everything back together? So even before he is elected the second time, he's going to start beginning his plans for Reconstruction. Now, before we move into Reconstruction, let's define that term Reconstruction. Reconstruction, what this is, guys, this is where we see, this is the plan to bring the country back together. When you think about Reconstruction, that's rebuilding. The South is going to have to be rebuilt. Basically, we're going to have to rebuild industry, infrastructure in the South because a lot of that's been destroyed. Unfortunately, we didn't get to go into a lot of that discussion about how, as the Union moved through the South, they destroyed a lot of the railroad stations, railroad tracks, telegraph lines, anything that they could to, of course, bring down the Confederate cause. Now everything's going to have to be rebuilt. But again, that big part of the Reconstruction is simply just bringing the country back together, bringing the Confederate States back into the Union. Now, by the spring of 1865, it's pretty clear that the Confederacy's almost done. Grant, Sheridan, and Sherman, they're headed towards Richmond, guys. They are headed towards, and I apologize, Richmond's not spelled correctly there, but they're headed towards Richmond, Virginia to take the capital of the Confederacy. Again, when we were talking about the wars for the capitals, remember, if we can take the capital down, we can end this war. Now, by the time that Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan are progressing towards Richmond, basically the Confederate government, they're going to flee. They're going to flee out of Richmond because they know that the war effort is over with. The Confederacy is breaking down at this point. The crazy thing about it, guys, is not only does Davis and his government flee Richmond, but they also burn the city to the ground. They want to make sure that if there's any supplies there or anything that could actually help the Union cause, they want to get rid of it. Now, by the second week of April, 1865, again, it's clear that the Confederacy is done. The capital has been taken. Richmond has been taken by the Union forces. It's only a matter of time before a surrender actually happens. Now, where the surrender is going to happen, guys, is at a little town outside of Richmond, Virginia, known as Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Very interesting name. I've always thought that since I was a kid. But this surrender is going to take place April 9th, 1865. Grant and Lee are going to meet in a house, a small house in Appomattox Courthouse. They're going to be surrounded by their supporting generals, their officers that have supported them through the cause of the war. They're going to sign the surrender. And interestingly enough about the surrender per Lincoln is that the terms of the surrender are going to be very generous. He's not looking to hurt the Confederacy. He's not looking to, well, in some terms, punish the Confederacy if some people want to happen. But again, Lincoln simply wants to bring the Union together. And if you punish the Confederacy, is it really going to create union? Is it going to bring the country back together in a civil way? And we're going to see as we get through Reconstruction, this is going to be a bit of a mess. It's going to be very hard pulling the country back together because you still have very diverse interests that are at heads with each other over the issue of now slavery is fixed to be abolished. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. And that's going to lead to a lot of disunion as well. So let's very quickly talk about the cost of the war. Now, one of the things about the Civil War, guys, and we talk about loss of life in the Civil War, this is the deadliest war in American history. When you actually, I had another chart on here, but it didn't show up very well, so I didn't want to show it to you guys. But you can go look this up. There's tons of information showing you comparison charts about where the Civil War falls when it comes to casualties and deaths compared to other American wars. And by the time that we get through this war effort, and of course the mortality rate, they've counted, of course, the number of deaths that's actually happened in the Civil War. It's over 600,000 deaths that occurred during the Civil War. And sadly enough, a lot of these people don't actually die from their injuries in the war, they actually die from disease. But not only is this war costly when it comes to human life, it's also very costly when it comes to economic cost. Just very quickly, you can see that the Union War cost a total of $2.3 billion. The Confederate War cost about $1 million for them. And of course, the Union is going to cost a lot more because they're producing all the supplies. They're the ones that have the ability to make this, so of course they're buying supplies, so they're spending a lot more money. The Union cost increased the national debt from $65 million in 1860 to $2.7 billion. Now, we're not going to go through the rest of this for the sake of time, but it just goes to show you, not only is this a very expensive war in human history, it's also a very expensive war when it comes to human lives lost. All right, so to wrap our discussion up for today, guys, let's end the war so that next week we can start off solid. I was hoping to get a little bit further into Reconstruction, but we'll knock out Reconstruction next week, and then we'll move into industrialization our last week together. But to discuss the end of the war, guys, by this point, one of the big things that Lincoln does before he does in the war, or the war effort is ended, in January of 1865, he makes a massive push to have Congress pass something called the 13th Amendment, okay? The 13th Amendment is vitally important. This is really what this war is all about in the end. The 13th Amendment actually abolishes slavery in the United States. There's a fantastic movie called Lincoln that was made just a couple of years ago, and the whole premise of that film actually talks about Lincoln trying to get the 13th Amendment passed through Congress and that struggle to get the amendment passed. It's fascinating looking to how difficult it was to actually pass that amendment. But the 13th Amendment is going to be very important because that's going to cause a lot of discontent and some issues between the North and the South as we move into Reconstruction. Now, very quickly to kind of finish this up, we see that civilians follow new paths. Some soldiers stay in the Army, others become civilians, some go west. We'll see that more a little bit later on. Clara Barton, we talked about her earlier and her efforts in the Union Army as a nurse. She's going to help revolutionize the way that battlefield medicine is practiced. And in 1881, she's actually going to found the American branch of the Red Cross. And of course, we know the Red Cross, they come out a lot and help in crisis situations, natural disasters, whatever else, to support people war efforts. And of course, she's going to help create that branch here in the United States. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about real quick, guys, is unfortunately the assassination of Lincoln. This is one of these moments in American history that it really makes you think about the what ifs. What if Lincoln would not have been assassinated? What would Reconstruction would have looked like? What would the next 20 years of American history look like? And that's very important because we see a lot of positive strides in American history when it comes to the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which we'll talk about more next week. But we also see a lot of discontent. And if Lincoln would have been in office, would that discontent would have played out? Now, very quickly, guys, last thing, April 14th, 1865, just a week after the surrender, Lincoln decides to take a trip out to see a show at a theater. Ford's Theater in D.C., beautiful theater, goes into the presidential box, and unfortunately, he's actually shot by a Confederate sympathizer. Now, I'll go into this a little bit more next week, guys. This is a very deep plot here. Multiple people are involved in this plot to not only kill Lincoln, but to kill other people in his cabinet. If you ever get the chance to go to Washington, D.C. and go to Ford's Theater, it's really fascinating to see how this played out, and it's a very in-depth history. And we'll talk about Booth more next week, and we'll talk about why, of course, this assassination happened. So guys, just remember, next week we're going to dig into Reconstruction. I hope you guys have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you guys next week to finish up with Reconstruction, and then we're going to move into industrialization. Thanks, guys.